"Thief! He stole my money!" The desperate cry echoed down Bourbon Street, a piercing shriek that cut through the thick, humid New Orleans afternoon like a razor blade. Richard Sterling, a man accustomed to the measured tones of boardrooms, turned instinctively. The motion was so sudden it interrupted the multi-million-dollar negotiation he was conducting on his phone as he walked toward his hotel. His eyes scanned the bustling sidewalk and locked onto a flash of motion. A small boy, no older than 8, sprinting desperately along the cobblestone path. He was being pursued by a large, sweating man whose face was contorted in a mask of fury as he bellowed a stream of obscenities. "Get back here, you damn little rat," the pursuer roared, but his short, heavy legs were no match for the boy's nimble agility. The child ran as if his very life depended on it, weaving through the throng of tourists, deftly dodging pedestrians and leaping over the shimmering puddles left behind by a rain shower that had ceased only moments before. His bare feet slapped against the wet stones, occasionally slipping, but he never once broke his stride. He was painfully thin for his age, his clothes torn and frayed, yet they were, surprisingly, clean. He clutched a small wooden shoeshine box, which swung violently with every stride he took. It happened in an instant. The boy risked a glance over his shoulder, checking the distance of the man chasing him, and in that split second of distraction, his foot caught on a loose stone. His small body flew through the air in a clumsy arc, and he came crashing down directly at Richard Sterling's feet. Acting on pure instinct, Richard dropped his phone and crouched down, his arms reaching out to break the boy's fall. "Oh, God!" the boy groaned, a pained whimper escaping his lips as he tried to scramble to his feet. "Sorry, mister, I didn't mean—" The sentence died in his throat the moment his startlingly green eyes met Richard's. But it wasn't the boy's eyes that made the powerful CEO's heart stop cold in his chest. It was the bracelet, a delicate band of white gold wrapped around the child's thin wrist, glinting softly even under the grey, overcast sky. It was a bracelet Richard knew more intimately than any priceless jewel in the world. A bracelet he had commissioned himself from a high-end Tiffany & Co. boutique in Miami, with the name Ethan engraved in elegant, flowing script. Alongside the name was a date that had been seared into his memory with a branding iron of grief, July 16th, 2020. It was the exact same bracelet his own 4-year-old son had been wearing on the day he vanished from the face of the earth, exactly 5 years ago. The world around Richard ceased to exist. The cacophony of the French Quarter, the traffic, the distant jazz music, the chatter of the crowd faded into a dull, distant buzz. The voices of the people around him became incomprehensible murmurs. He felt the blood turn to ice in his veins as his hands began to tremble, an uncontrollable tremor that started in his fingertips and radiated through his entire body. His breath hitched, coming in short, shallow gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs like a runaway engine, and for one terrifying moment, he was certain he was going to collapse right there on the sidewalk. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice so faint, so broken that he could barely hear it himself. The boy blinked in confusion, still trying to shake off the shock of the fall. How do you know my name? Do I know you?" The confirmation, spoken in that small, innocent voice, struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. Tears, hot and immediate, sprang from his eyes, carving chaotic paths down his face in uncontrolled torrents. 5 years, 5 long, torturous years of desperate searching. 5 years of sleepless nights haunted by the same recurring nightmare of a guilt so profound it had hollowed him out from the inside. And now, here he was, his Ethan, alive, older, speaking to him as if he were a complete stranger. "Oh my God," Richard repeated, his voice cracking as he extended his trembling hands toward the boy's face. "Ethan, my son, it's me, it's your dad." The effect of his words was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The confusion in Ethan's green eyes was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror, as if he were staring at the devil himself. He recoiled violently, snatching his shoeshine box from the ground and scrambling backward. "No, don't hurt me! Mr. Rico said to stay away from men in suits," Ethan cried out, his high-pitched voice echoing with panic. "My mum said you rich men only bring trouble to poor kids." "Ethan, wait, please. My son," Richard implored, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He tried to move closer, but every step he took caused Ethan to retreat even further. "I've looked for you for all these years. I never ever stopped loving you." But Ethan was already running again, this time fleeing from Richard with the same desperate terror with which he had fled from the other man. "And leave me alone. My dad abandoned me when I was just a baby. You're nobody to me." "Ethan!" Richard screamed, his voice raw with the agony of 5 years of pent-up grief. But the boy had already vanished into the dense New Orleans crowd like a phantom, leaving only the chilling echo of his words to slice through his father's soul. My dad abandoned me." Richard collapsed to his knees, right there on the wet cobblestones, the strength gone from his limbs, and he began to sob. He wept in a way he hadn't allowed himself to since the day his world had ended, a storm of gut-wrenching, body-shaking sobs. Pedestrians began to stop and stare, their curiosity piqued by the bizarre sight of a well-dressed, affluent man crying hysterically in the middle of Bourbon Street, but Richard was oblivious to them. He couldn't bring himself to care. Ethan was alive, his son was alive, but he hated him. The pain he felt in that moment was a new and exquisite form of torture, completely different from anything he had endured over the last 5 years. It was a dizzying, sickening blend of absolute euphoric relief and total, crushing despair. Ethan was physically here. He seemed healthy, but the words he had spoken were like a dozen knives twisting in Richard's chest. His own son believed he had been abandoned. His own son saw him as an enemy. The fat man who had been chasing Ethan finally lumbered up, panting heavily beside Richard. "Hey!" he wheezed. "Did you see where that little thief went? He stole $20 from me!" Richard slowly lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and blazing with a fury so intense it was almost primal. He barely restrained himself from launching himself at the man. "Oh, he didn't steal anything," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "Here is your $20. He ripped a $50 bill from his wallet and threw it at the man's feet. "And if I ever find out that you laid a single finger on my son, I swear to God, I will ruin your life." The man, visibly startled by the venom in Richard's gaze, backed away quickly, muttering something about crazy rich folks, before disappearing into the crowd. Richard was left alone on the sidewalk, the world spinning around him as he tried to process the impossible reality of what had just happened. Ethan. His Ethan had been just a few feet away, and he had fled from him as if he were a monster. How could this have happened? How had his son ended up on the streets of New Orleans, shining shoes to survive, without a single person recognizing him despite 5 years of relentless, nationwide searching? The memories came rushing back, a painful, overwhelming avalanche. Richard remembered the last day he had seen Ethan. It was a Wednesday, in March of 2020, exactly 5 years ago. Ethan had just turned 4 the previous week and was in the most adorable phase of his childhood. He talked non-stop, asked a million questions about everything, and had a habit of running to hug his father's legs the moment he walked through the door after work. "Daddy, Daddy, look what I drew for you." That was always the first thing Richard would hear upon arriving home. Ethan had an entire collection of drawings he made specifically for his father. Colorful houses, flying cars, and always a family of stick figures where a tall man held hands with a small boy. On that fateful day, Richard had woken up before dawn to travel to Houston. He was on the verge of closing the biggest business deal of his career, the acquisition of 3 luxury hotels on the Gulf Coast. Ethan was still sound asleep when he left, But Richard had tiptoed into his son's room and placed a gentle kiss on the child's warm forehead. "Daddy has to go on a trip today, my prince," he had whispered into the sleeping boy's ear, "but I'll be back tonight for dinner with you." Ethan's green eyes had fluttered open, and he'd offered a sleepy smile. "Bring me a present, Daddy." "I always do, you know that," Richard had said, tucking the blanket around his son's small body. "Now go back to sleep for a little longer. When you wake up, you can play in the garden with Auntie Maria." Those were the last words they ever exchanged. Richard left the house at 6 a.m., caught the 8 a.m. flight to Houston, closed the deal in record time, and was on a flight back by late afternoon, filled with excitement to share the news with Ethan and to give him the remote-control monster truck he had bought at the airport gift shop. But when he arrived home at 8 p.m., he walked into a living nightmare. The mansion was swarming with police officers. His wife, Jessica, was sobbing hysterically on the living room sofa, and Maria Santos, the live-in nanny they trusted like family, was sitting in a chair, trembling and repeating the same phrase over and over like a mantra. "I only went to the bathroom. I was only gone for a minute. When I came back, he wasn't in the garden anymore." Richard let his briefcase fall to the marble floor with a loud thud and sprinted out to the backyard. "Ethan! Ethan!" he screamed until his voice was raw, but only the mocking echo of his own voice answered him. The children's swing set was still moving gently in the evening breeze, as if Ethan had just jumped off of it. His toys were scattered across the perfectly manicured lawn, abandoned in the middle of a game that would never be finished. "Where is my son?" he demanded of the lead detective, a grim, bald man named Borges. "Mr. Sterling, we're still investigating," the detective had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But all signs point to a kidnapping. There are no signs of a struggle, no blood." According to the nanny's testimony, she left the boy unsupervised for approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes. 15 damned minutes had been enough for someone to steal the most precious thing in his world. The investigation that followed was a bureaucratic hell. Incompetent police officers, a flood of false leads, and cruel extortion calls from people trying to profit from his family's agony. Richard hired the best team of private investigators in the country, offered multi-million-dollar rewards, appeared on national television shows, and plastered posters with Ethan's face all over the southeastern United States. Maria was interrogated dozens of times, but her story never changed. She had worked for the family for 3 years and was considered completely trustworthy. On the day of the kidnapping, she was looking after Ethan, as she always did on Wednesdays when Jessica went to her Pilates class. "Mr. Sterling, I loved that boy, as if he were my own son," Maria would cry during the interrogations. "I would never do anything to harm him. Someone must have been watching the house. They must have known our routine and taken advantage of those few minutes I was away." And Richard had believed her. How could he not believe a woman who wept genuine tears every time Ethan's name was mentioned? How could he suspect someone who had cared for his son with such affection and dedication? The months bled into a year with no concrete leads. The immense weight of the tragedy began to crush Richard and Jessica's marriage. She blamed him for being away on business that day. He blamed himself for not investing more in home security. Their fights were constant, brutal, and laced with a pain so deep it was toxic. "If you had just stayed home, none of this would have happened," Jessica would scream during one of their most violent arguments. "And if you hadn't gone to your stupid Pilates class, he wouldn't have been alone," Richard would retaliate, knowing he was being unfair but unable to control the torrent of his grief. It was his older brother, Peter, who kept their marriage from completely imploding in those first few months. Peter Sterling was 3 years older than Richard. He didn't share his brother's sharp talent for business, but he compensated with an unshakable loyalty and a generous heart. "You can't let this destroy you both," Peter would say during the family therapy sessions he himself had arranged. "Ethan needs you to be united when he comes back. And he is coming back." Peter was the only one who never wavered in his belief. When everyone else began to gently suggest accepting the reality of the situation and moving on, Peter remained steadfast. "My nephew is alive. I can feel it, right here in my chest." Throughout the 5-year-long hell that followed, Peter was there for every critical moment. He comforted Richard during his darkest breakdowns, accompanied him on wild goose chases based on false tips, and always managed to bring a sliver of hope when despair threatened to consume everything. But not even Peter's unwavering support could save the marriage. Jessica fell into a deep depression, started taking heavy prescription medication, and eventually decided she could no longer live in the same city where she had lost her son. She moved to Chicago to live with her mother and never returned. The divorce was finalized in the 2nd year after the disappearance. Richard threw himself into his work as a means of escape. He aggressively expanded his hotel empire, working 16-hour days. But the nights were always a torment. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's smiling face. Every time he passed a school or a playground, his heart shattered all over again. And now, 5 years later, here was Ethan right in front of him. Alive, healthy, but a world away from the cheerful, loving boy who had disappeared. The Ethan he had found on the street was wary, frightened, and had clearly learned to survive in a world far harsher than the gilded cage of the mansion where he was born. Richard wiped the tears from his face, rose from the sidewalk, and looked in the direction Ethan had fled. He didn't know how, but he was going to win his son back. He didn't know when, but he was going to uncover the entire truth about what happened that day. And he didn't know in what way, but he was going to make whoever was responsible for this tragedy pay for what they had done to his family. The war was only just beginning. If this story has already grabbed you, and you want to follow a father's relentless quest to reclaim his son from a web of lies, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We believe in the power of stories that touch the heart, and we bring you a new one every single day. Don't miss out on what happens next. Richard didn't sleep a wink that night. He paced back and forth in his penthouse apartment in the Garden District, clutching his phone in his trembling hands, waiting for the private investigator, Marcus Ribeiro, to call with any information. With every minute that passed without news, a desperate agony grew inside him. Ethan was alive. That certainty was the only thing keeping him upright. But Ethan also feared him with a genuine terror, and that pain cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever felt. How had his own son learned to fear him like this? What diabolical story had Maria concocted to justify 5 years of lies? At 6:30 a.m., as the first golden rays of dawn began to shimmer over the Mississippi River, the phone finally rang. "Richard, I need more time," Marcus said, his voice weary. "I've been on their trail for 12 hours. But whoever helped Maria go into hiding did a professional job. Her documents were expertly forged. Marcus, I can't take another day of not knowing where my son is sleeping. I understand, but I can't give you bad information. Give me 48 more hours. I'll find everything." Richard spent the next 2 days in a state bordering on madness. He couldn't eat, he couldn't work, he couldn't think about anything other than Ethan. He hired 3 more private investigators to speed up the search, offered extra money to informants, and almost went out himself, planning to search every slum in New Orleans, boy by boy. It was Peter who stopped him from doing something reckless. "Brother, you look terrible. What's going on?" Peter asked on the morning of the 2nd day, showing up at Richard's apartment with coffee and painkillers. Richard looked at Peter, always protective, always present, and felt the urge to tell him everything. But a strange feeling made him hesitate, an inexplicable sensation deep in his gut, as if an inner voice was whispering, "Wait, don't tell him yet." "It's just work, Peter. I'm closing a complicated deal." Peter didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. "Take this medicine and try to get some rest. You're going to end up in the hospital if you keep this up." On the morning of the third day, Marcus finally called with concrete news. "I found him. Richard, Ethan is living with Maria Santos in a housing project in the 9th Ward, Acacia Street, number 117, apartment 203. But there's something strange about this story." An hour later, Richard was in Marcus's simple office in the Marigny. The investigator placed a thick folder on the table, his expression troubled. "Maria moved to the 9th Ward 4 months after Ethan's disappearance," Marcus began. "She rented the apartment using documents in the name of Maria Conception Santos. She only changed her middle name, but the documents are too perfect to be an amateur forgery." "How did she get the money to support herself?" Richard asked, opening the folder and seeing photos of Ethan at different ages. 5 years old in a small park, 6 years old helping Maria with the laundry, 7 years old with a school backpack on. She worked as a cleaner and maid in various houses in the area. Low wages, a simple life, but Ethan never lacked the basics. A simple private school, food on the table, clean clothes. Richard paused at a photo of Ethan at 7, wearing a blue and white school uniform, smiling shyly at the camera. There was still a hint of the cheerful child he had once been, but his eyes already showed a premature seriousness. "He looks happy," Richard murmured, touching the photo gently. "Neighbors say Ethan has always been a polite and smart boy. Good grades, never caused trouble, but he's also a bit withdrawn. He doesn't play much with other children," Marcus continued, flipping through more pages. "The problem started about 2 years ago. Maria developed diabetes and hypertension. The medical bills complicated their financial situation. The more recent photos showed a different Ethan, thinner, his clothes carefully mended, but still with those bright green eyes Richard knew so well. That's when he started working on the streets," Marcus continued, "first selling gum at traffic lights, then shining shoes. Maria tried to stop him, but Ethan insisted. He said a real man helps his family." Richard felt a physical pain in his chest. His son, at 8 years old, was already carrying the responsibilities of an adult. Meanwhile, Richard had enough money to support 1,000 families. "But here's what doesn't add up, Richard," Marcus said, pointing to spreadsheets with numbers. "Even in their worst financial moments, Ethan was never without school or decent food. I did the math. It's impossible for a cleaner to support a child so decently on those wages in New Orleans." "What are you trying to say?" "Someone was sending them money. Not a lot, but enough to supplement their income. Small, regular deposits, always in cash. Impossible to trace." Richard processed the information. Who had an interest in keeping Ethan hidden, yet well cared for? Who knew Maria well enough to trust her with such a mission? "Marcus, now I need something else. I want to get close to Ethan without him knowing who I am." "Richard, that's incredibly risky. If Maria finds out—" "She won't find out. I'm going to completely change my appearance." 3 hours later, Richard emerged from a barbershop in the Trem, unrecognizable. He had his hair cut short, grew a full beard, and dyed his hair a darker color. In a popular department store, he bought faded jeans, football team t-shirts, and a worn-out baseball cap. He took off his gold Rolex and put on a $50 digital watch. The transformation was stunning. Looking in the mirror, Richard saw a common working man, someone who could be any Louisiana native struggling to get by. The next afternoon at 2 p.m., Richard was on Bourbon Street in disguise, pretending to wait for a bus while he watched the flow of people. It didn't take long for him to spot Ethan approaching with his shoeshine box, offering his services to pedestrians. "Shine your shoes, boss. I'll make 'em sparkle for $5, Ethan called out, his Louisiana accent thick, a world away from the carefully curated pronunciation he had at 4 years old in the mansion. Richard watched Ethan work for almost 2 hours. The boy was professional, polite but firm in his pricing, always aware of his surroundings. When a customer tried to haggle, Ethan replied, "Come on, mister, I do good work. It's worth the 5, you'll see." It was impressive how Ethan had developed the street smarts to survive. At 8 years old, he knew how to negotiate, deal with adults, and defend himself verbally. But Richard noticed something more troubling. Ethan was in a constant state of high alert, always ready to run. When Ethan was packing up his materials, Richard approached him slowly. "Hey there, champ. Still got time to shine one more pair?" Ethan looked up and studied Richard for a few seconds. His green eyes narrowed slightly, as if he recognized something but couldn't quite place it. "Yeah, mister, $5. "Deal." Richard sat down on the makeshift stool. "You work here every day?" "Nah, mister, only when I ain't in school," Ethan said, starting to clean the shoes with quick, precise movements. "I study in the morning, then I come here to hustle in the afternoon." "And you like school?" For the first time, Ethan's face completely lit up. "I love it. I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up. My mum's always sick, so I'll be able to take real good care of her." Richard almost lost his composure right then and there. Ethan dreamed of becoming a doctor to care for the woman who had kidnapped him. The irony was too cruel. "Wonder your mum is sick a lot." "Yeah, she's got diabetes and high blood pressure. The medicine's real expensive. That's why I work. A man's got to help his family, right, mister?" The accent was thick, the slang was natural, but there was something in Ethan's facial expressions that made Richard certain this was his son. "You're too young for so much responsibility. How old are you?" 8. "I'll be 9 in July," Ethan said, finishing one shoe and starting on the other. "My mum says I'm mature for my age. It's because my dad abandoned me when I was a little baby. I had to become a man real fast." Richard clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. It took every ounce of his self-control not to explode with rage and pain. "Did your mum tell you about your dad?" Ethan stopped shining and looked directly into Richard's eyes. For a second, it felt as though he was about to be recognized, but the feeling passed. "She said he was real rich and didn't want a poor kid to support. When I was born, he wanted to give me away to other people, but my mum saved me and ran away with me." Every word was a stab to Richard's heart. Maria had constructed a perfect narrative to justify the kidnapping, painting him as the absolute villain of the story. "That's why my mom always taught me to be careful with men in suits and fancy cars. Those rich folks only want to do harm to poor people like us." "And you've never wanted to meet your dad?" Ethan went back to shining, but now with harder, more aggressive movements, clearly irritated. "What for, mister? If he didn't want me when I was a baby, I ain't gonna go looking for him now. I've got my mom, and she's worth 10 dads. Sometimes adults make mistakes, you know. Sometimes they—" "My dad didn't make a mistake, mister," Ethan interrupted, a hardness in his voice that startled Richard. "He knew exactly what he was doing. My mum told me everything. He said kids were too much trouble and too expensive. He preferred to keep his money." Richard paid the $5 and added a $5 tip. Ethan was surprised by the generosity. "Thanks, mister, you're a good dude." "Ethan," Richard said, trying to control the emotion in his voice. "That bracelet you're wearing, where did it come from?" Instinctively, Ethan brought his hand to his wrist, protecting the bracelet as if it were a treasure. "It's been mine since I was little. My mum kept it safe for me. It's the only thing I have from when I lived in the big house." "The big house?" "Yeah, mister. When I was real little, I lived in a huge house with a garden and a swimming pool, but I don't remember much." Ethan fell silent for a moment, as if trying to grasp at distant memories. "I only remember there was a man who sometimes played with me in the garden, but then he disappeared and never came back." The world stopped for Richard. Ethan had fragmented memories of him, but couldn't connect them to his present reality. 5 years of brainwashing had created an almost insurmountable barrier. How would you feel if you found out that this man didn't disappear because he wanted to, but because someone didn't let him stay with you? Ethan stopped everything and stared at Richard with growing suspicion. His green eyes narrowed and his body tensed, ready to bolt. "Why are you asking all these strange questions, mister?" Richard realized he had stepped onto dangerous ground. "Sorry, kid. It's just that you remind me a lot of a boy I once knew. My mum always taught me not to talk too much with strangers," Ethan said, quickly packing his materials into his box. "I gotta go now. Thanks for the $10. "Ethan, wait!" Richard called out, but the boy was already walking away at a brisk pace. Richard followed him from a distance, keeping himself hidden among pedestrians and street vendors. Ethan walked for about 15 blocks, clearly knowing the downtown streets well, until he reached a bus stop. Richard saw Ethan get on a bus headed for the 9th Ward and decided to take the next bus on the same line. 40 minutes later, he was watching from afar as Ethan got off at the housing project and walked up to the 2nd floor of a yellow, peeling building. Apartment 203. Marcus's information was correct. Richard stayed on the street, hidden behind a telephone booth, watching the apartment window. A few minutes after Ethan went inside, he heard voices coming from the slightly open window. A female voice he recognized immediately, even after 5 years. "Maria Santos. How was work today, my prince?" "It was okay, Mom. I made $10. There was this really nice mister who gave me a $5 tip." "That's wonderful, my love. That will be enough to buy the math notebook you needed. Mom, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, my son. That man, the one who lived in the big house with me when I was little. Did he look like me?" Richard felt his heart accelerate. Ethan was thinking about their conversation. "Why are you asking that, Ethan?" "A mister today. He said some strange things. He said that sometimes adults make mistakes without meaning to." "Ethan, listen very carefully to what your mother is about to say." Maria's voice turned more serious. "That man didn't do anything by accident. He knew exactly what he was doing when he decided he didn't want you. You can't be thinking about this nonsense." "I know, Mom. It's just, sometimes I dream about him, playing with me in the garden." "Those are just dreams, my love. Forget about those things and come have dinner." Richard watched the shadows move in the window for another hour. Ethan and Maria, the victim and the kidnapper, living like a real mother and son, while the biological father suffered alone on the other side of the city. But now Richard was absolutely certain Ethan was physically well cared for, but he had been brutally kidnapped emotionally. Maria had created an alternate reality so convincing that Ethan defended his own kidnapper and hated his true father. When he got back to his apartment, Richard found 5 missed calls from Peter on his phone, all within the last hour. For the first time in 5 years of unconditional support, Richard didn't return his brother's call. Why? He couldn't explain it. It was just a strange feeling, as if that inner voice was whispering again, "Don't tell Peter yet. Wait a little longer." Richard went to sleep with his mind buzzing with questions. Who had helped Maria financially for 5 years? Who had access to the information needed to plan such a perfect kidnapping? Who knew the Sterling family's routine so well? And most importantly, why, for the first time in 5 years, did he not completely trust Peter? The next morning, Richard woke up with a singular certainty. He needed to investigate everyone who had access to his house in the months leading up to the kidnapping, including the people he trusted most. Because Ethan hadn't just vanished into thin air. Someone had taken him, and that someone knew the Sterling family very, very well. Richard spent the entire night in his home office, surrounded by papers, old photos, and documents from the time of the kidnapping. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just grieving, he was investigating with the cold detachment of a professional detective. And the more he dug into the past, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a disturbing way. He spread out all the family photos from the years before the kidnapping on his large desk. Richard, Jessica, Ethan, and always present at family gatherings. Peter helping Ethan learn to ride a bike. Peter carrying Ethan on his shoulders at his second birthday party. Peter consoling Richard after his fights with Jessica. In every important photo, Peter was there. Peter was always there, Richard murmured to himself, analyzing each image with a magnifying glass, always in the right place at the right time. He took a notebook and began to jot down facts that had once seemed like normal coincidences, but now took on a sinister meaning. Peter knew the household routine perfectly. He knew that Richard traveled for business like clockwork on Wednesdays. He knew that Jessica went to Pilates punctually at 2 p.m. He had known Maria for 3 years, ever since she started working for the family, and always defended her when Jessica complained. And most importantly, Peter had always been in chronic financial difficulty, but he had never asked for help directly until 2 months before the kidnapping. Richard remembered the awkward conversation they had in his hotel office perfectly. In January 2020, Peter had arrived, sweating with nervousness, asking for a $200,000 loan to save his small construction supply business. "Richard, it's the first time I've ever asked you for something like this, but if I don't get this money, I'm going to lose everything." "Peter, you need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I can't keep bailing you out." "How did you get into this situation?" "I made some bad deals, trusted the wrong people. Then learn from your mistakes and rebuild from scratch, like I did." Peter had left that meeting visibly shaken, but without showing any anger. He had just said, "You're right, brother, I'll figure something out." Had he really figured something out? In what diabolical way? Richard took an old phone from a drawer and dialed Marcus. "I need an urgent investigation into my brother, Peter Sterling. I want to know every detail of his financial life for the past 6 years." "Richard, are you sure? Peter has been your biggest support through this whole tragedy." "That's exactly why, Marcus. I need to be absolutely certain that my suspicions are completely wrong. When it comes to Ethan, I can't leave any stone unturned." 2 hours later, at 9 p.m, Richard stood in front of his bathroom mirror, mentally preparing himself for the most difficult confrontation of his life. If Peter was really involved in the kidnapping, it meant that 5 years of brotherly support had been a cruel, elaborate lie. It meant that the shoulder he had cried on belonged to the man who had caused all his pain. Peter's apartment was in a simple, middle-class building. It was a modest 2-bedroom apartment, a world away from the luxurious penthouse where Richard lived. When Richard rang the bell, he heard hurried footsteps on the other side of the door. Peter opened it with a genuine smile, but Richard noticed that his eyes were slightly swollen, as if he had slept poorly. "Richard, what a great surprise," Peter said, embracing his brother. "Come in, man. You've been MIA these last few days. I was worried sick about you." Richard carefully observed every micro-expression on Peter's face. He seemed genuinely happy to see him, with no obvious signs of nervousness or guilt. But Richard had learned that the people closest to you were the best at hiding deadly secrets. "Peter, I came here because I need to talk to you about something very serious." "Of course. Sit down on the sofa. Want some coffee?" "I just made a fresh pot." Richard sat on the simple living room sofa and looked around carefully. Old but well-maintained furniture, a few family photos scattered on a shelf. And in a special frame on top of the television, an enlarged photo of Ethan at age 3, smiling in the mansion's garden, wearing the exact same bracelet Richard had seen on the shoeshine boy's wrist. And Peter, do you remember all the details of the day Ethan disappeared? Peter stopped stirring his coffee and looked at Richard with a serious expression. How could I ever forget the worst day of our lives, brother? Why are you asking this? I want you to tell me where you were, what you did, who you talked to that day. I was in my office all day, trying to salvage what was left of my failing business. I remember you called me in a panic around 8 p.m, crying that Ethan was gone. Richard decided to lay the first trap. Peter, I need to tell you something that's going to shock you. I found Ethan. The effect was immediate and profoundly revealing. The coffee cup dropped from Peter's hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. He turned as pale as a sheet of paper. His hands began to tremble visibly, and he leaned against the counter as if he were about to faint. What did you say? You heard me. I found my son. Where? How is he? The questions tumbled out, but there was something in Peter's voice that wasn't just surprise or joy, it was panic. Why are you so nervous, Peter? Nervous? I'm not nervous. I'm in shock. Oh my God, Richard, after 5 years of searching. Peter tried to clean up the broken shards from the floor, but his hands were shaking so much he almost cut himself. Tell me everything. Where was he? Who was with him? But Richard was watching much more than his words. He was analyzing the body language, the excessive sweating, the altered breathing, and everything indicated that Peter wasn't surprised to find out that Ethan had been found. He was terrified. Peter, sit down with me. I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to be completely honest. Peter sat in the armchair but couldn't stay still. He fidgeted, rubbed his hands together, and avoided direct eye contact. In all these 5 years of investigation, you never found it strange that none of the leads ever amounted to anything concrete. What do you mean, strange? Peter, a 4-year-old boy doesn't just evaporate. Someone took Ethan, someone who knew our family routine perfectly. Peter turned even paler. Richard, what are you trying to insinuate? I'm trying to say that whoever planned my son's kidnapping knew exactly when I traveled, when Jessica left the house, when Maria was alone with Ethan. Maria, Peter murmured, and immediately realized he had said too much. What about Maria? Nothing. It's just, I always thought she was a bit suspicious. Suspicious how? Peter began to sweat more visibly. Ma, I don't know. She asked too many questions about you guys, about the house routine. That's interesting you say that, Peter, because I remember very clearly you always defending Maria whenever Jessica complained about her. I remember one time when Jessica said Maria left Ethan alone for too long, you said she was a trustworthy person and that Jessica was exaggerating. Peter fell silent, clearly trying to formulate a response that wouldn't incriminate him further. But his silence was more revealing than any words could be. Richard stood up and began to pace the room like a prosecutor interrogating a defendant. He stopped in front of the photo of Ethan and picked it up with both hands. Peter, you know where my son has been for these 5 years, don't you? Richard, for God's sake, how could you even imagine something like that from me? Then explain something to me. How did Maria manage to support herself for 5 years on a cleaner's salary? How did she manage to keep Ethan in a private school? Peter tried to feign ignorance, but Richard saw the exact moment his brother's face betrayed everything. It was the expression of a man who had just realized he had fallen into a mortal trap. How do you know she kept Ethan in a school? I don't know anything about that. You just asked me how I know. That means you already knew. Peter shot up abruptly, running his hands through his hair in a clear display of total desperation. He began to pace back and forth, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. Peter, enough with the lies. Sit down and tell me the whole truth. Now. "Richard, you're not going to understand." "Try me!" Richard exploded, slamming his fist on the coffee table with such force that it cracked. "My son spent 5 years away from me, 5 years thinking I had abandoned him." Peter collapsed onto the sofa and buried his face in his hands. He stayed like that for long minutes, sobbing like a child, until he finally began to speak, his voice completely choked with emotion. "Remember when I asked you for that $200,000 loan? I remember it perfectly. My business wasn't just in financial trouble. I'd gotten involved with some very dangerous people. I owed money to violent loan sharks." Richard sat down in the armchair opposite the sofa, mentally preparing himself to hear the most devastating confession of his life. "When you denied the loan, I went into a total panic. The guys said that if I didn't pay in 30 days, they would kidnap someone from the family for ransom. So, 3 days after our conversation, I was in a bar alone, thinking about killing myself. That's where I met Maria." Richard felt his world begin to crumble all over again. "You met Maria in a bar." She was crying, drinking alone too. She said she had just lost a baby in her 8th month of pregnancy. "We comforted each other that night." "You slept with her." "It was only one time, Richard, but she got pregnant." "Oh my God." "When I found out about the pregnancy, I thought I could help her by getting her a job. That's when I suggested she work at your house." Richard was beginning to understand the monstrous dimension of the tragedy. "You put Maria in my house, knowing she was the mother of your child. But she lost our baby too, Richard. In the 7th month of pregnancy, she was completely psychologically devastated. And then, 2 weeks before the kidnapping, the loan sharks showed up at my office. They said that if I didn't pay the $200,000 by the end of the month, they would kidnap Ethan and demand a ransom of $1 million. Richard stood up and went to the window, trying to control the urge to destroy everything in the room. "And you let it happen." "No!" Peter shouted, also standing up. "I went to Maria and told her the whole situation. I said we had to tell you, call the police, do something to protect Ethan, but she had a different idea. She said that if we faked the kidnapping first, she could take Ethan far away, raise him in safety, and then, after a few months, when I managed to get the money to pay the loan sharks, she would bring him back to you." Richard pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. "It was supposed to be temporary, a few months at most. Maria swore she loved Ethan, as if he were the son she had lost. She said she would take better care of him than any biological mother. And how did you execute this diabolical plan?" Peter took a deep breath before continuing. "That Wednesday, Maria called you, saying Ethan had a fever, and asking if she could give him some medicine. You authorized it over the phone, remember?" Richard remembered perfectly. He had been at the Houston airport when Maria called. She gave Ethan a light sedative to make him sleep. Then she told Jessica she was taking him to a private hospital because his fever was high. Jessica trusted her so much she didn't even question it, and they left the mansion without any suspicion. Maria had prepared everything: fake documents, money I managed to borrow, a rented apartment in the 9th ward. When she came back 3 hours later, she said Ethan had run away from the garden while she was in the bathroom. Richard turned to face Peter. "When the loan sharks who were threatening you, when Ethan disappeared, they realized it no longer made sense to ask for a ransom. They dropped the debt and went after other business. Meanwhile, I spent millions searching for my son. My marriage ended. I almost killed myself from despair." "I know," Peter exploded, tears streaming down his face. "Do you think I didn't suffer too? Do you think it was easy watching you cry every day, knowing that I could end your pain with a single sentence? Then why didn't you tell the truth?" "Because in the 2nd year, when I secretly visited Maria and Ethan, I realized that the boy didn't remember you anymore. He called Maria Mom and seemed genuinely happy." Richard sat down again, feeling his legs weaken. My son forgot me. I thought maybe it was better to leave things as they were. Ethan was well cared for. Maria truly loved him, and you would eventually be able to rebuild your life. Rebuild my life! Richard stood up furiously and kicked the coffee table, breaking it in half. How was I supposed to rebuild my life without my son? Peter recoiled, afraid of his brother's growing violence. Richard, I was trying to protect everyone. You were protecting your own cowardly hide. You're right, Peter whispered. I'm a coward. I'm selfish. I destroyed everyone's lives because of my pathetic debts. Richard looked at the brother he had always admired and saw a completely broken man. 5 years of lies had corroded Peter from the inside as well. During these 5 years, you were sending money to Maria. Peter nodded. $300 a month. It was all I could scrape together working as a sales representative. While I was dying of heartbreak, you two were playing happy family. Richard, forgive me. For the love of God, forgive me. Richard looked at Peter, his brother, his greatest support for 5 years of hell, and at the same time the sole architect of all that hell. And he felt an explosive mixture of rage and disgust. Peter, you are going to help me fix this tragedy. How? First, you are coming with me to the 9th Ward to tell Ethan this entire truth personally. Second, you're going to turn yourself in to the police and take full responsibility for the kidnapping. And if I do all that, can you ever forgive me? Richard looked out the broken window, seeing children playing freely on the street, and thought of Ethan shining dirty shoes to buy expensive medicine for his kidnapper. I don't know, Peter. Honestly, I don't know if I will ever be able to completely forgive you. But I know that you are going to help me bring my son back home. Peter nodded, finally accepting that the time had come to pay for 5 years of total cowardice. The war for Ethan's soul was about to truly begin. On the following morning, Richard woke with a steely determination he hadn't felt in 5 years. He was no longer just a desperate father searching for his lost son. He was a man who knew the whole truth and was ready to seek justice. Peter had spent the night at Richard's apartment, sleeping on the living room sofa, mentally preparing for the final confrontation that would define the rest of their lives. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Peter asked, drinking coffee in the kitchen, his hands still trembling uncontrollably. Peter, after 5 years of cruel lies, it's time for the absolute truth. Ethan needs to know who his real father is and who destroyed our family. What if he doesn't want to come with you? What if he prefers to stay with Maria? Richard looked at Peter coldly. Then I will respect his wishes, but he will know the complete truth first. At 10 a.m., the two brothers were in Richard's car, driving in tense silence toward the 9th Ward. Peter stared out the window with the expression of a man on his way to his own funeral, while Richard drove with his knuckles white on the steering wheel, imagining every possible reaction from Ethan upon discovering the truth. The housing project was a cluster of yellow, peeling buildings, typical of the city's outskirts. Children played in the dirty courtyards. Colorful clothes dried on lines strung from the windows, and the smell of home cooking mingled with the constant noise of televisions and neighbors. Conversations. Apartment 203, 2nd floor, Richard murmured, parking the car in front of the building where his son had grown up for 5 years, far away from him. They climbed the cracked concrete stairs without a word. With each step, Richard felt his heart beat faster and his breathing become more difficult. In a few minutes, he would be face to face with the woman who had kidnapped Ethan and with his own son, who hated him without knowing the truth. Richard knocked on the door with controlled force. They heard hurried, nervous footsteps from the other side, and Maria's familiar voice asking, "Who is it?" "Maria Santos. It's me, Richard Sterling. Open this door right now." The silence that followed was deafening and lasted for almost 2 minutes. Then they heard the sound of several locks being slowly undone, one by one. The door opened just a crack, and Maria appeared, her eyes wide with pure, absolute terror. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, desperately trying to close the door again, but Richard was faster, pushing the door open with force and entering the small, simple apartment. Peter followed him inside, and Maria backed away until she hit the living room wall, trembling like a leaf in the wind, clearly in a state of total panic. "Where is my son, Maria?" Richard demanded, looking around the modest but lovingly tidy apartment. He's still at school," Maria stammered, tears already beginning to stream down her face. "Mr. Sterling, I can explain everything." 5 years, Maria. For 5 long years, you let me suffer like a madman, thinking my son was dead or being tortured by unknown criminals." Maria began to sob uncontrollably, knowing there was no escape. "I took good care of him. I swear to God, I took good care of Ethan. He never wanted for anything." "You kidnapped my son!" Richard exploded, punching the wall with such force that he put a hole in the drywall and bruised his knuckles. It was at that exact moment that the apartment door opened again. Ethan ran in with his blue school backpack on and the uniform Richard had seen so many times in the investigation photos. "Mom, I forgot my math notebook and—" Ethan stopped dead in the middle of his sentence upon seeing Richard and Peter in the living room. His green eyes filled with the same terror he had shown on Bourbon Street. "It's him, Mom!" "It's the rich man who was asking me strange questions yesterday." Ethan ran behind Maria, using her as a human shield, clearly terrified. Richard felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces all over again, his own son hiding from him, seeing him as a mortal threat. "Ethan, my prince, don't be afraid of me," Richard said, slowly crouching down to be at the child's level. "And I didn't come here to hurt you or to take you away by force." Are you really my dad?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and natural curiosity. "Yes, I am, my son. I am your father who loves you more than anything in this world and who never stopped looking for you for a single day." Ethan looked confusedly at Maria, then at Peter, trying to make sense of the situation. "Mom, you always said he abandoned me because he didn't want to spend money on me. Why is he here saying he loves me?" Maria couldn't stop crying and didn't know what to answer. She looked desperately at Peter, who was leaning against the wall with an expression of absolute guilt, and then at Richard, who was waiting for an answer with tear-filled eyes. "Ethan, sit here on the sofa with me," Richard said softly, extending his hand. "Your mother Maria and Uncle Peter are going to tell you a story, a true story, about what really happened when you were little." Ethan hesitated for a few seconds, looking suspiciously at Richard, but eventually sat on the old sofa, still holding tightly to Maria's hand. Richard sat carefully in the armchair opposite him, while Peter remained standing, sweating with nervousness and guilt. Maria, now you are going to tell my son who you really are and what you did to our family," Richard said, his voice firm but controlled so as not to scare Ethan. Maria sobbed for several minutes before she could form coherent words. "Ethan, you remember how Mommy always told you that your rich father didn't want you because kids were too much trouble?" Ethan nodded, watching every expression on Maria's face intently. "Mommy lied to you, my love. I lied to you for all these years. Your father never abandoned you, not for a single second. He looked for you every single day for 5 years. He spent all his money looking for you." Ethan frowned, trying to process information that contradicted everything he believed about his life. "Then why am I here with you and not with him?" Peter stepped away from the wall and knelt, trembling, in front of Ethan. "Because I did something very, very wrong, Ethan. Your dad is my younger brother, and I asked Auntie Maria to take you away from the big house where you lived." "But why?" Ethan was becoming visibly agitated and confused. "Because I owed a lot of money to dangerous people, and they said they would kidnap you if I didn't pay. I thought you would be safe with Auntie Maria for a few months, just until I could solve my problems." Ethan fell silent for long minutes, processing information that was destroying everything he believed about his identity. Then he looked directly at Maria. "You're not my real mom," Maria cried even harder, knowing she was losing the boy she loved as her own son. "No, my prince. Your real mother's name is Jessica. She had to move away to Chicago because she became very sad and sick when you disappeared. And you stole me from my real family." The innocent but direct question hit Maria like a gunshot to the heart. I loved you as if you were my own biological son. When I lost my baby, you became the only reason for my life to exist." Suddenly, Ethan began to cry desperately, not from sadness, but from total confusion. "I don't understand anything. Why did everyone lie to me?" Richard stood up and tried to approach, but Ethan recoiled in fear. "Don't come near me. I don't know who to trust." Ethan's reaction was exactly what Richard had feared. An 8-year-old child, discovering that his entire life had been a lie, was having a complete emotional breakdown. "Ethan, I know you're confused and scared," Richard said, maintaining a respectful distance. "But I can prove that I am your real father." Richard took a folder with old photos and documents from his pocket. "Look here, my love. This photo was taken at the hospital the day you were born. I held you in my arms for the first time and promised that I would protect you forever." Ethan took the photo with trembling hands and studied it carefully. It showed a younger Richard holding a newborn baby with tears of happiness in his eyes. And these here," Richard continued, "are photos of you with me at home. You playing in the garden, me giving you a bath, you sleeping in my lap." The photos clearly showed the genuine father-son relationship between Richard and Ethan during the first 4 years of his life. "Why don't I remember you?" Ethan asked, still crying. "Because you were very little when you were taken. And also," Richard looked at Maria, "because Auntie Maria taught you to forget me." Ethan turned to Maria with growing anger. "You made me forget my real dad." Maria could no longer speak, only cry and nod her head in affirmation. "Ethan, want to see more proof?" Richard showed him stacks of posters, newspaper clippings, and television ads. "And these are 5 years of posters with your picture on them, reports asking for information, detectives I hired. I spent millions of dollars trying to find you." Ethan flipped through the papers. Seeing his own face on missing person posters spread throughout the country, he saw television reports with Richard crying desperately and pleading for information about his lost son. "You cried for me all those years." "I cried every single day, Ethan. Every day for 5 years. There were nights I couldn't sleep, wondering if you were okay, if you had food, if someone was hurting you." Ethan looked at Peter with pure rage. "And you let my dad suffer, knowing where I was." Peter was crying now too. "Yes, Ethan. I'm a coward and a selfish man. I destroyed our entire family's life because of my money problems." "I hate you," Ethan screamed at Peter and Maria. "You lied to me my whole life." Ethan ran to his room and slammed the door shut. Richard and Peter and Maria were left in the living room in total silence, listening to Ethan cry alone. After 20 minutes, Richard knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Ethan, can I come in?" "Go away." "My son, I am never going away again. I'm going to stay right here until you're ready to talk to me." Richard sat on the floor outside the room and stayed there for 2 hours, talking to Ethan through the door. "Ethan, I know you're angry and confused. You have every right to be. But I need you to know one thing. I will never, ever abandon you again. It doesn't matter if you don't want to live with me. It doesn't matter if you prefer to stay with Maria. I will always be close, always taking care of you." Slowly, the door opened. Ethan appeared, his eyes red from crying so much. You promise you won't lie to me? I promise on my life, Ethan. And you promise you won't take me away from Auntie Maria if I don't want to go. Richard swallowed the pain of that possibility. I promise. The decision is yours. Ethan sat on the floor next to Richard. I want to meet my mom, Jessica. Do you want me to call her right now? Ethan nodded. Richard took out his cell phone and dialed Jessica's number in Chicago. When she answered, Richard said simply, Jessica, I found our son. Jessica's cry of joy was heard throughout the apartment. Is he okay? Where was he? Can I talk to him? Richard passed the phone to Ethan. Hello? Ethan, my baby, is that really you? Jessica was crying with happiness. Are you my mom? Yes, my love. I'm your mommy who loves you more than anything in the world and has never forgotten you for a single second. Ethan talked to Jessica for 40 minutes. She told him stories from when he was a baby, sang lullabies that Ethan vaguely remembered, and promised she would take the first flight to New Orleans. When he hung up the phone, Ethan looked at Richard. Can I ask you a hard question? Anything. If you both loved me so much, why did you let me be taken away? Richard took a deep breath. Ethan, sometimes bad things happen even when people do everything right. I was working to give you a good life. And in that time, bad people took advantage and took you away from me. And now, what's going to happen to me? Now, you decide. You can come live with me and your mom, Jessica. You can continue with Maria, or you can spend time in each place until you feel safe. Ethan was thoughtful for long minutes. I want to know my real home, but I also don't want them to lock up Auntie Maria. She took good care of me. Ethan, Maria and Peter will have to answer for what they did, but that doesn't mean they are entirely evil people. 3 days later, Ethan was in the mansion in the Garden District for the first time in 5 years. Jessica had returned from Chicago, and the reunion was emotional but also difficult. Ethan didn't remember her clearly and needed time to rebuild their relationship. He explored the house with a curiosity mixed with sadness. He recognized some corners, vaguely remembered the garden where he played, but he still missed the simple life he had with Maria. Dad, this house is too big. I could get lost in here. You can choose any room you want, Ethan, and you can change anything you don't like. Ethan chose a small room, similar to the one he had in the 9th Ward. He didn't want excessive luxury yet. The first few months were difficult. Ethan had frequent nightmares. He would wake up crying, calling for Maria, and had trouble adjusting to his new school. A psychologist specializing in childhood trauma was hired to help him. Ethan has divided loyalty syndrome, Dr. Anna explained to Richard and Jessica. He loves you, but he also loves Maria. He needs time to process that he can love everyone without betraying anyone. Richard and Jessica were patient. They allowed Ethan to visit Maria in prison once a month. These visits were painful, but necessary for Ethan to make peace with his history. On the 3rd visit, Ethan told Maria, Auntie, I forgive you for lying, but now I want to stay with my real family. Maria cried but smiled. I just wanted you to be happy, Ethan. Now I know you will be. A year later, Ethan was completely adapted. He had friends at school, excellent grades, and a wonderful relationship with Richard and Jessica. The couple had reconciled their marriage and rebuilt their family on a more solid foundation. Dad, can I tell you something? Always, my son. I'm not angry with Uncle Peter and Auntie Maria anymore. They did something wrong, but they taught me how to be strong. Richard hugged Ethan. You are the wisest boy I know. On Ethan's 10th birthday, he made a special request. I want to visit Auntie Maria and bring her a piece of my cake. The entire family went to the prison. Maria cried upon seeing Ethan so happy and healthy. Nash, Ethan, thank you for not hating me, she said. Auntie, you took care of me when I needed it. Now my dad and mum are taking care of me. Everyone has a place in my heart. 5 years after their reunion, Ethan was 13 years old. He was one of the best students in his school and dreamed of becoming a lawyer to help families who go through problems like mine did. Peter had been released from prison and worked as a volunteer in social projects. Ethan had forgiven him completely, and they saw each other occasionally. Maria was also released and lived modestly but peacefully. Ethan visited her on Christmas and her birthday. On the day Ethan turned 14, Richard gave an emotional speech at his party. "My son, you taught me that true love overcomes any betrayal, any lie, any pain. Thank you for giving me a second chance to be your father." Ethan replied in front of all the guests, "Dad, thank you for never giving up on me. Now I know that no matter what happens in life, there's always someone who loves you enough to fight for you." The Sterling family had been reborn from the ashes, stronger and more united than ever. Love had conquered fear. Truth had defeated lies. Justice had triumphed over betrayal, and forgiveness had healed wounds that had once seemed impossible to mend. Ethan grew up knowing that even when all seems lost, true love always finds its way back home.